Hi there, and welcome to Censored But Not Silenced with Rebekah Koffler. Today, I will present to you my intelligence analysis on the growing strategic partnership between Russia and China and the threat that these two pose to the United States. I have an editorial running on Fox News website titled 5 Reasons Why the Growing Russia-China Strategic Tandem Presents an Existential Threat to the United States. As some of you know, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, on September 15th at the SCO summit, SCO being the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. SCO is a geopolitical, economic, and military alliance, somewhat like an Asian version of the European Union and NATO, just a combination. The interesting thing about the SCO is that Russia and China are the founding members of it. And in addition to that, the members include the four stans, the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Plus, eventually, India and Pakistan joined. And at this point, at the last summit, Iran signed a memorandum of understanding to join this alliance as well. Why is this alliance important and why has it emerged? Well, Russia and China have concluded that the center of gravity is moving to Asia in terms of international commerce, finance, and investment. And what is precipitating this trend is the incompetent, I would call, policies of the Biden administration, specifically the sanctions policy that intended to change the behavior of authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin and the like, but they don't do that. And so we have the traditional adversaries of the United States, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea even joining forces in order to counter our country. That's why this alliance is important. This is not by itself an existential threat to the United States, but it's a long-term threat. Just a couple of interesting statistics about the SCO. It covers it's the largest regional organization in geographic scope and also in terms of the population. It covers 60% of Eurasian territory and also 40% of the world's population with the 30% of the global GDP. Okay, so here are the top 5 threats. I will address them individually to you, and then we'll break down each one of them briefly. But to begin with, I'd like to point out that, as you know, Putin's so-called special operation in Ukraine is having some major setbacks, with Ukraine having launched a major counter-offensive, and Ukrainian forces are being able right now to recapture some of the territory that Russia has occupied, 20% of that. So Ukrainians really enjoying the shift in the momentum on the battlefield, which inevitably makes Putin nervous. Despite that, Putin found the time to meet with Xi. Xi, on the other hand, is also burdened with some of the domestic issues that are going on right now, and foreign policy issues, not the least important of which is the situation with Taiwan. And also, in about a month, she is going to face the Communist Party Congress, where he's expected to win the third term. So definitely this meeting indicates that these two are placing priority on their meeting. In the run-up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, Russia and China announced the quote-unquote no-limit partnership. The two authoritarians support each other because they both have a common goal. And so Xi Jinping never criticized Putin for attacking Ukraine. And similarly, Putin supports the China One policy. At the meeting at the SCO on September 15, Xi Jinping referred to Putin as his old friend. And Putin was also very respectful, as he usually is, to Xi. And he noted that Russia is listening to China's position, China's concerns about Ukraine. So this meeting, interestingly, follows a 7-day strategic war games that took place in the Russian Far East, more specifically in the Sea of Japan and Sea of Okhotsk, where Russia and China and 12 other nations practiced aviation and naval drills. What was the purpose of those exercises? The war game scenario was to repel the so-called threat from South Korea, Japan, and the United States, and to launch the so-called joint special operation between Russia and China. Does that remind you of the phrase that Putin used when he invaded Ukraine? He said that there's really no war, but instead Russia was conducting the so-called special operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. So why am I concerned about this alliance? And just to be clear, this is not a NATO-type partnership. Russia and China are not friends at all. Their history has been quite tumultuous, full of border disputes, suspicions, cultural prejudices. In fact, border disputes is something that continues. They still have some territories that they haven't settled. And yet, these two have a common cause. What's the common cause? The common cause is to weaken the United States and its role in the world. And for China specifically, by 2049, China has a strategic goal of supplanting the United States as the dominant economic and military power. That is codified in the Chinese grand strategy, if you will. And Xi Jinping is taking China on the so-called road to rejuvenation. Why 2049? That's the date, which is the centennial anniversary of the creation of the People's Republic of China. So here are the top 5 issues that pose strategic threat to our country. First, both countries, Russia and China, have masterminded long-range strategies to destabilize American society through espionage, covert influence operations, subversion, and election interference. Russia and China use different methods. China has established 350 Confucius Institutes all across America on college campuses, where it indoctrinates the American students in the Chinese worldview, favorably predisposing our American students to China's policy. Why is that important? Chinese worldview is very different from the Western worldview. And specifically, I have already outlined what China is aspiring to achieve by 2049. Chinese also, just like Russians, routinely infiltrate spies into the United States. They also conduct influence operations to penetrate business, political, and activist groups. If you remember the Chinese operative Fang Fang and her close relationship to Eric Swalwell, a very prominent US politician, unfortunately for wrong reasons. Russia, on the other hand, infiltrates deep cover agents. Back in 2010, President Obama gave up for some reason, I don't know why, 10 Russian deep cover operatives, sent them back to Russia instead of having them being flipped over and making them double agents and having them work for us. He sent them back to Russia. Both Russia and China routinely intervene in our elections, but not necessarily to select a very specific person. They don't have that power. It's the American people who select our own president, but what they do is they try to foment discord, disorder, and create chaos, if you will. There's a doctrine that the Russians have developed specifically to destabilize the United States called controlled chaos or controlled instability. So what happened in 2016, the Russians ran clandestine operations that was enhanced by a cyber operation to not only hack the DNC servers, but also to leak the information in order to divide Americans. The information was damaging to Secretary Hillary Clinton. Then, unfortunately, the US intelligence agencies fell victim to Russian disinformation, and then they ran some of their own, spreading the false narrative that former President Trump was a Russian agent. So, unfortunately, they were doing Putin's bidding. It is the corrupt intelligence officials like James Clapper, former director of national intelligence, James Comey, former director of the FBI, and John Brennan, former director of the CIA. They were using Putin's playbook or fell victim to it, dividing Americans because they falsely accused our own president of being Putin's puppet. But in reality, none of that was true. And we know that's not true. There were multiple reports. And in fact, if anything, Trump pursued the most robust, the most formidable policy towards Russia since Ronald Reagan. So that's number one. So that's a long-range subversion type of threat. The more immediate threat is the fact that Russia and China both develop doctrines that seek to defeat the United States on the battlefield. It's not that they are planning to invade the United States and put boots on the ground or launch missile strikes on the United States out of the blue. None of that. But in the event that the United States intervenes in regional conflicts, such as the one on right now going on in Ukraine, or in the regional conflict between Taiwan and China, both regimes developed a systematic doctrine. Each of them is different, that envisions the defeat of our forces. And you probably will say, well, how's that possible? The US military is the best military in the world. We're highly trained. We have superior weaponry. Well, here's how. Both countries have concluded that our strategic vulnerability is our reliance on technology. How do we conduct our military operations? We're highly reliant on our space capabilities. Satellites. We do missile warning, we do intelligence, reconnaissance, we do navigation, we do targeting. Everything goes through satellites. Not only that, in our daily life, we're highly dependent as well. We can't even make it to the grocery store, to the gas station without turning Waze or Google Maps or some sort of GPS app, especially the young people. Also, our banking transactions, our gas stations, our hospitals, everything is dependent on technology. Our blood supplies are also dependent on technology. And both Russia and China, for that purpose, developed superior cyber capabilities that they use routinely in peacetime to hack our business, government, and all sorts of networks. But in wartime, they both have the doctrines to ratchet up those cyber intrusions all the way for them to become actual cyber attacks, targeting our critical infrastructure, including the power grid. And so they figured that even though we're militarily superior to both of these countries, if they can deny us use of our satellites, of our technological crutch, if you will, then two things could be achieved. A, they could potentially deter us from entering the conflict. This is why, by the way, the Biden administration was very clear in the beginning of Putin's invasion of Ukraine that the United States was not going to put boots on the ground. Why is that? Because Washington experts, so to speak, have concluded that we wouldn't be able to sustain our military operations because Russia would, as the Russians say, would make our forces deaf and blind by attacking our satellites, preventing us from collecting imagery of the targets on the ground. They would jam our GPS. We wouldn't be doing targeting and navigation. We wouldn't be able to conduct communications for the commanders to send troops to the right location. And China, by the way, is the same thing. And in fact, the Pentagon is so worried about Russia's and China's space and cyber capabilities that it is conducting classified deliberations to address that threat. So that's the real threat. If those two join forces, and I'm not saying that it's a likely scenario, given the fact that Russia and China are not true allies, the likelihood of that is not high, but it all depends on the scenario. It all depends on where on the escalation ladder we are in the conflict. Because remember, the Russians and Chinese view the United States as their mortal enemy. And if Putin loses to the point in Ukraine where the United States demonstrates to China that it has the upper hand and it will use that upper hand in the Taiwan conflict, then the likelihood is that Xi Jinping will help out Russia. In fact, today, China already provides the economic lifeline to Russia, which has been sanctioned by the United States. The Russians were hit with unprecedented level of sanctions, but because Putin sanction-proofed his economy in the run-up to the invasion, the sanctions don't have the desired effect. In fact, ruble is one of the strongest currencies right now, believe it or not. Whereas our economy is in a recession, our gas prices have skyrocketed. Europe is about to enter recession. Today, the sterling pound hit the lowest level in Great Britain since 1935. Not to say that Putin has pre-planned all of this, because he couldn't have possibly imagined the level of economic chaos, if you will, that the Biden administration would be willing to force on our own economy with these sanctions and on the European economy. But Putin does have a PhD in the economics. He also has a top advisor, Elvira Nabiulina, who's MIT trained. He added another PhD economist. So he's looking at the battlefield holistically. It's not just on the ground that he's conducting the war. It's also in the information space. It's in the energy space. He's quite adept at using energy as a weapon. And so the fact that China's trade with Russia is soaring right now, and trade with the United States is decreasing. So Russia provides to China oil, gas, and various agricultural products. Russia and China are finalizing one of the major pipelines called the Power of Siberia. It's already pumping natural gas to China since 2019, and by 2025, this $55 billion pipeline will be finalized. Why is this important? It's important because the Russians shut down Nord Stream. That's the pipeline that provides energy to Europe. And Europeans are at risk of freezing this winter. And Germany specifically their leadership is very concerned about the situation. They are trying to ration energy. But that's the outcome of the incompetent economic policy that the Biden administration has been pursuing, which has been pushing Russia and China, the two traditional, the most aggressive adversaries of the United States. The Biden administration has been pushing them together. That's the sort of the violation of cardinal rule of strategy, of grand strategy number one. You do not push your friends away like Biden did with Saudi Arabia, and you do not bring your adversaries together. So not only we created the China monster through our very myopic economic policy, we effectively outsourced our entire manufacturing base to China because of the cheap labor, and we're now reliant on them not only for I don't know, masks and sanitizers, which was very apparent during the beginning of COVID, but we rely on them for painkillers. We can't even produce our own Tylenol or most of the medicines. So now we're creating a two-headed monster, the Russia-China so-called no limits partnership, right? The Putin and Xi strategic tandem. Or if you look at it another way, it's even a four-headed monster because Iran and North Korea are joining that alliance of dictatorship. Iran has been providing drones to Putin, whose military is really being weakened because of the situation in Ukraine. The North Koreans are providing construction workers to Putin. And there's something interesting that one of the Russian officials said about the North Korean workers. He said that one of the deputy prime ministers, that the reason why Russia is importing the North Korean construction workers is because their productivity is 2.5 times higher than those of the Russian workers. Isn't that interesting? So that is the situation with the economic aspect of this alliance. And there's some really disturbing long-term ramifications of the Biden administration policy. How so? The confidence of the international community, specifically those countries that are authoritarian, and they want to decouple the human rights issues from the business issues, such as Saudi Arabia, for example. They're looking to China and Russia in the alternative economic architecture that they're establishing under their leadership, such as the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because they don't want to be the target of U.S. sanctions policy. So what does that do? It undermines the confidence of those countries in US dollar as the premier currency of international reserves and the key medium of exchange. Russia and China both have created their own SWIFT alternative payment system. And in fact, they have developed a method to exchange business transactions in yuan, in the Chinese yuan, and in the Russian rubles, bypassing the euro and the dollar. And so even countries like India are now interested potentially in using those payment system in the long term. And so the longer that goes, other countries are going to look to this type of situation. So China today announced that it sanctions two of our own defense companies, the major defense contractors, Raytheon and Boeing, for their supplies of military equipment to Taiwan. So that is the situation with the economic aspect. Bottom line, the fact that both Xi and Putin have a certain sense of urgency about bringing their strategic goals to fruition during this time, when we have the Biden administration in charge and both countries have assessed this administration as the best opportunity for them to achieve those goals. Why? Because there's no respect, there's no forceful policy, if you will. If anything, the policy is haphazard, and it has no strategic foresight, right? The Biden administration is chasing bright and shiny objects. They want so desperately to help Ukraine, which is understandable. Everybody wants to help Ukraine, but at what cost? So we have already signed up to provide about 62 billion in traditional military aid and other assistance to Ukraine, to the point we are depleting our own weapons supplies. So the Pentagon is committed to bleed out the Russian military. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin himself stated that it is the Pentagon's goal to degrade the Russian military and to weaken its economy so that Putin does not do such terrible things again, such as attacking another country. But on the other hand, we are bleeding our own weapons supplies, right? So she is sitting there and thinking, what a great deal. The two top security threats to China, the way that the Chinese perceive it, the United States and Russia. Yes, China and Russia are strategic allies, so they want to present it, but they are not true allies. They're more marriage of convenience, as I explained. But for the time being, they're joining their forces to counter the United States because we are their common threat. But underneath, Russia and China are actually adversaries. They have about 4,300 kilometers border, about 2,500 miles. And so most of the weaponry that Russia has been developing is in order to fight the war with the United States that the Russian military strategists have concluded is inevitable, right? Because we're fighting over the same territory, over the control, geopolitical control, economic control of Eurasia, and Ukraine is part of it. Russia perceives Ukraine as part of its own sphere of influence, and NATO would like Ukraine to be part of the Western world, which is a red line for Putin. And so about 10 years ago or so, the Russian general staff, through forecasting, long-term intelligence forecasting, have concluded that a war between Russia and the United States is inevitable, and this is why, on Putin's orders, a specific war plan has been developed, whereby Russia would exploit the perceived vulnerabilities of our armed forces and our civilian infrastructure, the reliance on technology, and the fact that technology is just very easy to penetrate. So why is this important? It's important because such war is quite a possibility. Why is that? As you probably know, I've written a book, and I'm a former DIA intelligence officer and specialist in Russian doctrine and strategy. And in my book, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America, which came out last year, I predicted Putin's invasion of Ukraine. How did I do that? Well, not only I did that, I tried to warn my leadership in the DIA, in the intelligence community, in NATO, in the White House. I briefed, many combatant commanders and all sorts of military and political officials, but nobody wanted to believe it. And there were all kinds of excuses made why Putin wouldn't do what he wanted to do, and that is reintegrate the alliance that is similar to the USSR back under Russia's control. Well, former deputy commander of NATO, Sir Sharif, just the other day also warned that NATO should be prepared for an all-out war with Russia. Now, what happens when she decides to pull some levers with regard to Taiwan? It's the best opportunity for she to do this. Why? Because if they synchronize, they being Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, if they synchronize the timing of their combat operations or some non-kinetic catastrophic activities such as major cyber attacks, and Russia and China have superior arsenals of cyber weapons. So that would create what we call in the Pentagon a two-theater war. And that's what our combatant commanders are very worried about. Officially, the Pentagon has been operating under the assumption that US forces are capable of handling two wars at the same time. But if you look at what's going on right now with the erosion of our combat readiness, whether it's because we are massively committed to Ukraine and we're depleting our own supplies, or because of all the woke ideologies that our military academies are spreading, and all those silly things, the pronouns and all that nonsense, we're losing really our capability, and in fact we're having trouble recruiting into the military for a couple of reasons. Physically, very small percentage of youth can even pass the physical test to become a warfighter for various reasons, whether it's obesity or other things. And also people are not willing. People are not willing anymore. They see what's going on in the military and all the silly stuff, and also lack of appreciation. The Biden administration has been attacking the law enforcement, the military, calling the military extremists and things like that. So that definitely undermines the young people's confidence in our government's intentions in terms of going and fighting these wars and mishandling. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was very shameful. We left tremendous amounts of military hardware in the hands of Taliban, of all things, and having sacrificed 6,000 American lives, $2.2 trillion in 20 years, having defeated Taliban, and now Taliban is back in power. So what were all those sacrifices for? So the young people's confidence in our commanders, in our government pursuing the right policies for the right reasons, has been eroding. And that is all very evident to Xi and Putin. And as I said, they are very pressed for times. Both of them are not spring chicken. Putin is going to turn 70 on October the 7th. Xi Jinping is 69. The lifespan for males in China is about 70. In Russia, it's 66 to 68, depending on how you count. And so there's a sense of urgency. And that's where that high risk comes in, is our inability potentially to handle the two crises at the same time, with these two authoritarians who have a very comfortable relationship with each other. Like I said, they're not friends, but they project mutual respect. They are simply transactional. There's no, human rights angle. In fact, they pursue a very non-confrontational approach with each other, and underneath, they're basically engaged in a raw pursuit of national interests and the survivability of their regime. And that is why we have a situation where one of them is clearly desperate, that is Putin. He is cornered. And he's recalibrating his strategy in Ukraine, where he will likely do something very drastic because his psychological profile is such as that he is not going to back down. And I have another editorial also on Fox News titled Top 5 Reasons Why Putin Will Not Stop to Wage War in Ukraine, where I go through his decision calculus. And on the other hand, we have a guy, Xi Jinping, who all his life was getting ready for this moment when he would enable China to become that dominant player economically and militarily by 2049. And that is why the probability of a war scenario on two fronts at this time with two nuclear powers, both of whom have been modernizing their nuclear weapons at a very accelerated rate recently. And this is why it presents a situation for us that is extremely, extremely risky. And the chances of them rationalizing getting into a dust up with the United States at this time is high. And we see that in their military training. As I said, that just last week they conducted the exercises, the strategic war games, Vostok 2022. They do that every 4 years. That increases their interoperability. It allows them to practice their doctrine, their tactics, techniques, and procedures. So the threat is real. And unfortunately, what we have right now in charge is people who don't prioritize combat readiness. So I'm going to wrap up at this point. Please go on Fox News website and check out my editorial. I'm Rebekah Koffler with Censored But Not Silenced. The editorial is titled 5 Reasons Why the Growing Russia-China strategic alliance is presenting an existential threat to the United States. Check it out. If you like my podcast, Censored But Not Silenced, please subscribe. Like me, tell your friends, rate it on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. Visit my website, RebekahKoffler.com. Buy my book, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. It's available everywhere. Follow me on Twitter, at Rebekah0132. Rebekah is spelled Rebekah 0132. I'm on Getter. Thank you for listening, and I hope that everybody gives this editorial a good read, shares it with friends, and really gives it a thought about whom we need to have in charge in our Pentagon as well as in the White House so that they could handle this type of two-theater war that is no longer a hypothetical, but unfortunately, it's quite a possibility. Well, Russia and China certainly think that it's a possibility. Thank you. for listening. Rebekah Koffler, censored but not silenced. Goodbye.